All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So in my talk today, I'm going to focus more, a fair bit at the start on polymer science, and I hope I don't lose any of you who do not like organic structures. I will go into a couple of them, but essentially we want to predict. We want to design polymers. All right. That's really the fundamental of what we're trying to do here, and we want to design a polymer with a particular physical property in mind. And so one of the physical properties that's really interesting is cloud points. Now this has a lot of impact when you talk about drug delivery and anything biomedical, anything personal care, so anything that would go into your shampoo bottle or your moisturizer or your conditioner or your soap. And also it has some implications in catalysis, heterogeneous catalysis particularly. And so what influences this in terms of polymer design? One of the types of polymers that would influence this is this class of polymers called polyoxazolines, right? And they influence the temperature at which this happens, basically based on the composition, the percentage of each composition, and the size of the polymer, right? What would happen, or what you would see, is if you were to take something like this and heat it up to its cloud point, it would go from clear to cloudy almost instantaneously. And if you were to cool it down, it would go right back. And you could keep doing this in perpetuity, and it would just keep going on and on and on. So this is a really, really interesting behavior. And so what is the problem with this today? Well, first of all, if you look at any paper out there, you'll either get tables, graphs, or really the best that has been achieved is some random quadratic equation that sort of correlates everything, but it doesn't really give a fantastic fit. And there's a reason for this, and I don't blame all the researchers out there, because polymer interactions, they're extremely complex. You're talking about multi-scale interactions with themselves, interactions with their neighbors, interactions with the solution, and it's just a mess. But we are in the 21st century, and we're still relying on graphs and tables, and that's just not the way it works. And so we propose a methodology, a more modern methodology that brings together some of the fundamentals that you've seen or heard of today, which is, first of all, data curation. So making sure that we have knowledge of what goes in. We are well aware of our design specifications, so our repeating units and our building blocks, our molecular weights. Model training. So model training, so that's where we start applying machine learning algorithms to train a model that can predict this way. So you feed in a molecular weight, you feed in a composition, and it tells you what your cloud point is. And then doing it the other way, inverse design, by this thing called particle swarm optimization. And I'll explain the intricacies of this in a bit. But let's start with part one, simple stuff, data curation. So we start with, what sort of data do you have in literature? And you saw the sort of stuff I presented earlier, right? The tables and the graphs, and that's really what's available in literature. But what do we need to get this ML ready? You need to have this in a way that your data frames can be processed into a code. And you guys have been working today with codes, and you know what sort of data you roughly need. But you can't just do this, just go into it head first. You do need some sort of insight from a material science perspective. So let's talk about this traditional data structure, right? We took a whole bunch of this data structure, and we made it into a pandas data frame. So some of you who may have realized, we're using a package in Python called pandas, and pandas basically puts it in these really nice tables called data frames. And each of these units here are related to our compositional data, including the size, which is characterized by this number here, mn, molecular weight, and that relates to a particular cloud point. Now, if we look at our data, you could see some sort of relationship, right? This is percentage of A in our polymers, percentage of B, percentage, blah, 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 blah. You can see some sort of relationship, but I challenge anyone out here to tell me what I need to design to make a polymer with a cloud point of 65 degrees Celsius, for example. And the reason is because, and the reason I'm so confident in challenging you is because this data relationship is not trivial. It may look like there's some sort of relationship, but really it's very hard to predict. And you could potentially do this by making thousands or tens of thousands of polymers. But when one polymer takes 40 hours to make, that's 40,000 hours. That's a lot of time. And so that sort of gives us a really strong use case for machine learning. Now, training a model. So we've curated our data. We want to train our model. So what models can we use? I think somebody posted on the question forum on how do you choose your model? Well, we're going to go through and we're going to understand why we choose a particular model when we do. And how do we optimize that model and how do we make it perform as well as we can? With this in mind, we want to predict cloud point on the basis of oxazoline architecture, on oxazoline composition, and molecular weight. So when we're doing machine learning, or in this case, supervised learning, and we're predicting properties, right? If you think about it as a very simple mathematical function, y equals to fx, right? We have a function. We have x, which is our compositional data, our molecular weight. We have our property, y, which is cloud point. And there's some sort of relationship that we don't know, right? That governs the relationship of the two. So since we don't know this data, since we don't know this relationship, we need to learn this from data. That's where we get lots and lots of data, or not as much data, but essentially this data gives us some sort of relationship. Now, typically in the lab, if you were to do, say, a calibration curve, you would get a whole bunch of points and draw that line or do a quadratic equation that would govern that relationship. And this is exactly what we're doing here, right? And what we do is once we pick a model, say, for example, as I mentioned, a linear line or a quadratic equation, the purpose of supervised learning is to try and get that best fit to get as little of an error to your actual data as possible, right? And that is called minimizing the loss function, right? So let's talk about a linear regression. Linear regression is probably a simplest sort of regression, y equals to mx plus c, right? We learned that in school. It's the first go-to thing that we do, particularly if you're doing a UV vis curve, etc. But because it's simple, you can't apply it to something multi-scale like what we have here. So one of the options to work on something a little bit more robust is to use this thing called a decision tree regression. Now, a decision tree regression, very simply put, is, let's say you have this cubic function, right? And we know it's a cubic function because I'm telling you it's a cubic function. But if you didn't know this was a cubic function, how would you fit this, right? And so you pick a point in your data and pick that as true, right? Everything to the left of that, and I'm referencing that red line here, right? Everything to the left of that is a certain value, and everything to the right of that is a certain value. And you kind of have a fit. Then you can do it another time, where you pick another point here, you pick another point here, here, and everything to the left of that, everything to the right of that is a particular value. And you keep doing it over and over and over again until you get a fantastic fit. And this works great if you have a nonlinear function, if you want to do categorical inputs, numerical inputs, blah, blah, blah. But imagine if you had noise in this, right? If you had, this is really clean data. What if you had a point up here, and a point here, and a point here, and a point here? Well, that's why you need a model like this to be something that generalizes well over that space, right? And so what I mean by generalize is that it should perform well for the training data, but if I had some new data, it should perform equally well, noisy or otherwise, right? So back to that problem. Imagine that, right? I have a point here, I have a point here, and I've really fit it crazy well on this data. Now, what if I had a point here, the actual, or with an x value of say 0.8, the actual value is somewhere up here when it should be somewhere down here, right? So that's quite a lot of error. And so this overfitting happens, and this is one of the pitfalls of the decision tree. So some of the reasons could be that you have small data, your data set's too small, your model's too complex, your noise is too high, many reasons, right? I could go into this later on. But one of the ways that you can circumvent this is using a technique called gradient boosting. So let's go back to our initial example of the same cubic curve and the first layer of a fit, right? We have this, we have a certain level of fit. Now if we were to extract all the points that did not fit on this model, and then we were to run a fit on this, what we would get is this, and if you combine this fit with our original fit, you now get something in this region that fits much better than this, but not crazy like that green line that we saw earlier. And so this forms the basis of the model that we're going to go into. And it gives us that robustness to go through and understand what are the important features in our data set. Right, now I'm going to switch over to the code. Okay, so if you look at this folder, we're going to be using Jupyter again. So if you load Jupyter, or if you still have Jupyter, the Jupyter environment, you go to the AMD workshop page, and the correct files are in that first folder, Cloud Point Machine Learning. Is everyone there? Can I get a show of hands on who is not there? Okay, fantastic. Right, so in this folder, you'll see a whole bunch of files. We'll start with baseline. So that's the first file, baseline.ipynb. Anybody not in baseline ipynb? All right, fantastic. Okay, so let's go through the files. So the first lot, you're just calling a whole bunch of packages, pandas, numpy. These are all typical packages. sklearn is a machine learning package, and you'll understand that in a minute. So shift enter. Now, I do have to warn you guys, please don't shift enter until I do say so, because some of these will really slow down your computer, and unless you don't want use of your computer or you want it to really warm up a heck of a lot, I'll stop you when you need to. Okay, so you initialize those packages, hit shift enter to go to the next part, we load the data. And so data is basically that massive data frame that I presented to you earlier, and that is split between two bits of data. The first one is literature data that was mined through papers, and the second lot down here is experimental data that was made in my lab at IMRI. Okay, and then what you do is you do a train, validation, and test split. Now, I think somebody mentioned what is a training data and what is a testing data. Well, if you have a data set of 100 and something, right, from that data set, you take a small portion and put it aside, and that is going to be your test data, right? Everything else is used to train the algorithm or to do your fit. And that's essentially what we do here. Right? And so this is just labeling everything. And then we go into comparing our different regressors. So we have 4 different regressors here. The first one is a simple linear regression, which is y equals to mx plus c. And in this case, x is many things. One is a polynomial regression. And then there is gradient boosting. Right? And if you look at And so we basically call all the regressors with all the targets, and what you get at the end are 3 comparisons: linear regression, polynomial regression, and gradient boosting regression. And the error of these fits is characterized by this little number called RMSE, root mean square error, right? And if you see, the one that really matters is the test. And our test of validation for the gradient boosting is clearly one of the lowest of them all. What it does show is that we can achieve very good prediction from gradient boosting, as opposed to something like linear regression where your error is 13 degrees. Now 13 degrees is quite significant when your range is only between 24 and about 90, right? It's quite a huge percent. So I mentioned that one of the great things about gradient boosting is it also tells us the importance of features, right? And so what we are doing here is getting the algorithm to tell us in our data set, what are the most critical features that influence cloud point, okay? And I mean, for any polymer chemist out there, you'll know that some of these things are fairly intuitive. So M, right? M is molecular weight, MP in this case. That's one of our most important features, but we have another feature which is units of A. So it's one of the monomer units that goes in that is extremely important. Now I want you guys to remember this, the fact that units of A is super important in our design, because that's going to come in. I'm going to call that back in a bit. But molecular weight, who would have thought? Well, I mean, most of us would have thought, but sometimes, you know, it may give you insights that you didn't really think were there. Right. And so that's basically picking my algorithm, optimizing my algorithm. Now this is where things start getting interesting. Right. We look at inverse design. Now we have multiple variables going in, and we predict a cloud point, and that works really well, quite well, I think. But what is inverse design? Why do we need it? If you want to predict, so it's great, but if you want a material that has a particular property, in this case, I want a material that has a cloud point of say 60 degrees, right? How am I going to make it? So typically, in the mind of a polymer chemist, they'll go into the lab, or they'll look at literature, they'll look at people who've made roughly something at 60 degrees, and they'll go into the lab and they'll try that out, and they'll keep going and going and going until they find something that's maybe 62, and they'll be satisfied, and they'll walk away. Or sometimes even 65, and they'll be satisfied, and they'll walk away. Well, we want to do that, but we don't want to spend so much time doing it, right? And so that's the purpose of inverse design. We want the machine to design our polymer so we can go off and work on it. So one of the things is when we do inverse design, we want to constrain that search space. And so I mentioned that A is a really important feature. What if we don't want to use A? What if we want to minimize A? What if A is like super expensive, or we have to synthesize it and we spend a month synthesizing it and we only get maybe half a gram, right? These are the kind of questions that a material scientist would think of. And so that's something that we have to do. Maybe you also need to validate your prediction. So your machine learning algorithm may spit out 100 different polymers that kind of fit that. How are you going to pick between the 100 which one you're actually going to make? And so I'm going to talk about these things progressively. And so let's go back to the scientific motivation. Again, back to this. So I mentioned A, minimizing units of A. The reason we want to minimize units of A is because we've got lots of it. The other thing that you want to maybe constrain your search space in is, you know what? In my lab, I'm only capable of making something with a max molecular weight of 10,000, for example. So that's one of the constraints that you can put into this inverse design problem. And ultimately, right, can we design something that's novel? Can we use our training data set and extrapolate from there? Some of you who know a bit about machine learning know that machine learning doesn't really extrapolate very well. Can we achieve this? Well, first of all, let's talk about inverse design, right? So inverse design is essentially the inverse of your function. Y equals to fx. Well, now we want x equals to fy in that sense, f hat. So we have our objective function, which is basically our cloud point, and our constraint function, which is composition and size. So we want to predict composition and size from cloud point. One of the ways that you can do this is by particle swarm optimization. And I'm not a mathematician, but I am going to pull out the math. It's basically a general purpose optimizer, and it optimizes your search by continuously calling that forward predictive model. So the gradient boosting algorithm, it's going to keep calling that and keep doing predictions until it finds the right number. Think of this analogy. Imagine all of us are deep sea divers, and we all have radios that can talk to each other. Ignore the laws of physics. We're trying to find the deepest part of the ocean right now, right? And that's essentially an analogy. So all of us are searching the ocean, and then I radio you, and I say, hey, I found a deep spot. And you radio me, no, I found a deeper spot. So we all go there, and we all keep talking to each other until we find that deepest part of the ocean. That's essentially what a particle swarm optimizer does. There are lots of different alternatives, but for this example, we're going to just talk about PSO. Right? And that's part one. So particle swarm optimizer will give us a whole bunch of predictions, but you don't have just one solution. Now, if you think about a gradient boosting algorithm, because it is based on decision trees, you have a stepwise function, right? So for any one y, there are multiple solutions, and not all of these are actually correct. So how do you pick what is right and what is wrong? And that's where the difficulty lies, right? You can do a secondary validation using a neural network, and I think Danny presented or gave a really good presentation on neural networks. Neural networks are great. They might be a bit slower than gradient boosting, but they are a bit more accurate. Now, if you have an ensemble of neural networks, multiple neural networks predicting, you have a set of data here which sit on what is your ground truth, what is your actual relationship. And it's fairly easy to predict something within your ground truth, interpolating, right? And that would be a good design. Let's say you try to predict something that is outside of your ground truth, extrapolating. If your neural networks can't decide, or your multiple neural networks can't come up with the same number, chances are it's probably not true. So that means that if I were to predict, say, percentage of 5% of A and 20% of B and 30% of C and blah, 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 and it says, you know what, all the neural networks give me completely different cloud points, then you know it's probably not true. But if I were to predict something outside of this range and all of my neural networks give me the same answer, I know I'm onto something. That's one of the ways that we have extrapolated. Okay? And so if you think about the way we do this, is you have gradient boosting with decision trees that is trained on our data set. You have your X data, and it's able to predict your Y data. So your X is your compositional data, your Y data is your cloud point. You then take particle swarm optimization, which keeps calling on these gradient boosting, on the gradient boosting algorithm. You have your desired Y, or Y star, and that gives you a whole bunch of compositional information that you want to test. You can then take your X data and put it back into our ensemble of neural networks, and that will give us a whole bunch of Ys. And then we just look for the greatest variance between this and this. So we keep the Y hat as low as low variance as possible, and we keep this variance as low variance as possible. And that's how we selected the polymers that we had to make. And so I'll go through the code, and then I'll show you what happened after. So back to the first page. Now you need to click on inversedesign.ipynb. Anybody not in it? All right. This is where you don't press Shift-Enter unless I say that you should, right? I don't want your computers to all freeze up. Right, so the first bit, you basically call on all your packages, Shift Enter. And then you're just defining your algorithm and fitting your regressor. And this is an ensemble of neural networks. It's actually an ensemble of 10 neural networks because you start from 0, not from 10. Please do not press Shift Enter. You basically train your neural networks separately. And you can see that the kind of RMSEs that you get are fairly low, right? Validation RMSE is 1.57, which is much lower than what we were typically getting at about 6. And from there, what we do is we start the particle swarm. Now, particle swarm essentially optimizes over a certain set of temperatures, and we picked 4 temperatures, right? 37 degrees. Why? Because that's your body temperature, and it's great for biomedical applications. 45 degrees, 60 degrees, and 80 degrees, right? And it ran the optimization and generated a whole bunch of code, a whole bunch of design for each one of these temperatures. 49 each, right? 50 different designs, right? And it tells you how many units of A, how many units of B, how many units of C, blah, 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 that you require in your final polymer, right? Running that into your neural network validation, you then get a certain error. And you can see that with this, some of the error that you see is actually fairly large, right? Some of them go up to 40%, and some of them are as low as 4 or 5%. And we typically picked everything that had really, really low error. And we do that for each one of these temperatures. That's a lot of polymers to make. But from there, we picked our 4 best. Right? 4 best for each temperature. And what we get is something like that. Now, I want to draw your attention to this extrapolation thing that we did. In our training set, we only had polymers that had 1 component or 2 components max, right? In our final set, we have polymers with 3 components, everything that's highlighted in red, right? That is what I meant by an extrapolation. Our algorithm, or something like this, an algorithm like this, a combination of neural networks and gradient boosting is able to extrapolate. Not a lot, but just enough to gain novel insights into your material space. So we achieved material innovation, new material design, while keeping to the fundamental of really, really low error and designing the polymers that we want. So just a little bit of reading, if you're interested, on how we went about this and some of the background information. And I hope this has been helpful.